Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Omar and Rabie. We are delighted to have you join us here at Status Al Wada for a quick discussion on a recent paper that was just released, which we will address significantly today, titled Conflict Economies in Syria, Roots, Dynamics, and Pathways for Change. With us is Omar Dahi. He's a professor at Hampshire College, and Rabie Nasser, the co-founder of SCPR, Syrian Center for Policy Research, and of course a prominent researcher, as well as also both being colleagues and collaborators and friends on various topics. We are here to have a relatively brief discussion on the policy paper, and actually the context from which it emerged. So without further ado, let me start with asking Omar to tell us a little bit about the paper and the context of the paper, and any sort of details or insights you'd like the readers to take away from uh, this research.
Great. Thanks, Bassam. And it's really good to be here with both of you guys to talk about this. So let me just straight away get to the paper itself and tell you a little bit about how it was developed. Basically, this was part of the SCPR's Development Policy Forum. And this is the first in a series of papers that's going to discuss different aspects of the conflict economy in Syria, or conflict economies in Syria. So the idea for this first paper is to develop a comprehensive framework from a political economy perspective through which to understand the conflict in Syria, which basically means looking at the main actors, looking at the different policies that these actors have pursued and the outcomes that resulted from those policies, and doing so from a holistic perspective that includes not just a narrow definition or a narrow scope of looking at what a conflict economy means, but to try and expand the view, expand the picture of the notion of conflict economies. So as I mentioned, this is the first in a series. The idea is that there are subsequent papers that are going to be developed that expand on different aspects of the framework that is developed in this paper in more detail. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means. But this paper was developed really in a very unique methodology, which involved original research by the SCPR, by myself, previous research that the SCPR has conducted, as well as discussions with key experts on Syria, who each contributed their perspectives. And one of the unique aspects of this paper is that it tries to expand the scope of the conflict economy in encompassing three dimensions. First, our notion in this paper of conflict economies is really the transformations and distortions of the Syrian economy as a result of the conflict. So it's not trying to focus on perhaps traditional notions of war economies that look at specific supply chains of smuggling, illicit goods, or trafficking in oil. These are all parts of the conflict economy, but we're really looking at the transformation of the economy in light of the conflict. And so what we want to do is expand and broaden the analysis to capture the entire range of interconnections that exist not just on the ground level, but also on the regional and international level, all of which contribute to what we come to say are the conflict economies in the country. The second notion is to look at how the different actors in the conflict, which includes state and non-state actors, have instrumentalized economic policies to pursue the armed conflict, and the impact that this has had on socioeconomic development, on human development, on infrastructure. So it essentially involves looking at outcomes or phenomena that we see in Syria, which can include distortions, which include poverty, which include lots of recent things that are taking place, for example, such as the decline in the value of the Syrian currency, and trace those back to more concrete policies or actions that have been taken by the different actors. in their pursuit of the armed conflict. And third, it looks at how uh, the, the logic of the conflict at the economic, political, and social level can continue even in the absence of the armed conflict itself. And this has to do not just with perhaps looking at areas that used to have armed conflict but now no longer do so, as we see many areas in Syria where the logic of the armed conflict continues even after the battles themselves have subsided, but also antecedents. How can we look at a regional militarized landscape that preceded the armed conflict in Syria and laid the groundwork for it in many ways? So these are some of the notions that we try to advance in the paper.
Thank you very much, Omar. This is actually quite a summary. I've, of course, read the paper and I'm very well aware of the project. And there's a lot to talk about, but we all promised each other to be as brief as possible in addressing this at this very point. Rabie, if I may ask you a little bit about the context from which this paper emanated, in particular, the Development Policy Forum. Can you tell us a little bit about this forum and how it developed within SCPR and how this is actually the first research paper that is produced by the forum?
Yes, thank you, Bassam, and thank you for Omar for actually being the author of this paper, which is a cornerstone for the next series of papers on this topic. And I think the new about this approach is as follows. The center is working on policy-oriented research, trying to produce research that's relevant and influence the policy making, whatever this means in the Syria context. What we try to do is to produce research through dialogue, not to inject research into the dialogue. So always we are talking about the idea of having a theoretical research, or this is an abstract, or this is something that we produce just in our mind as researchers or scholars. So it's not something close to the reality. What we are trying to do in the center is to produce in a participatory approach a value added, a new ideas through a rigorous framework. And this is what we do in the Development Policy Forum, that we design the framework. For example, we designed the framework of political economy approach to understand the conflict economy and have a background paper about the concept of conflict economy. And we invite people from Syrians from different backgrounds, academics from academia, from research centers, from NGOs, from private sector, and we come together and sit for 2 days to think how to analyze the conflict economy, how to diagnose the actors, how to understand the strategy of each actors and the impact of that, for very much intensive work through 2 days at least. And of course, this is one I would say, workshop. So it's a series of workshops on one specific topic. So what's the value added of that is, first, we are building a dialogue between Syrians on evidence produced by them. So the only thing that the center is doing is to put the framework and bring this kind of participatory research to be the first part of agreement for the future. And the first part of building what we called it congruences, social congruences, not consensus, a gradual congruences among the Syrians through their own research, through their own participatory approach. So what we are expected from that, so far we have a series of dismantling conflict economy papers, and we worked on the political economy of constitution, and we are now working on the impact of the COVID-19 and how we can overcome that in the near future. Sorry for the long answer.
Abadan. Shukran. Thank you, Rabia. Can you tell us, maybe Omar, can you tell us a little bit about the Syrian experience in light of the traditional literature that we actually come across about civil wars and war economies? Because it seems from the actual content of the paper that if one goes to the paper assuming they're going to read about the dynamics of war economies, having to do with the drivers of wealth and the actual transactions that take place and so on and so forth, they might actually find that this is not what the paper is about. So can you tell us about the Syrian experience on the one hand, how it's different, and how this paper about war economies is actually about a certain lens through which you're seeing war economies?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, this connects with one of the things that Rabia mentioned in terms of how we produce this knowledge, because part of the reason we insisted, and the reason that the paper insists on this comprehensive notion, this holistic notion, is because this is something that reflects our own understanding of the conflict, but also when you talk to Syrian experts, when you talk about people with grounded knowledge, there was a desire in expanding the scope of what we think about as conflict economies to not just focus on these specific perhaps chains, as important as they are and as destructive as they are, but to look at what's happening to institutions in Syria, what's happening to human development in a broader sense, what's happening to the way that the pursuit of the armed conflict has, for example, led to slashing the expenditures on human development, slashing the expenditures on investments in infrastructure, all of it as a necessary aspect to pursue the armed conflict. In what ways is loss of territorial control or the gaining of territorial control by different actors really having an impact on internal trade and disruption of long-standing ties within the country? So that's basically something of a desire for a lot of people who are involved with Syria to basically have us focus on something that is beyond those narrow parameters that you mentioned. But in many ways, I think what we're seeing in Syria, and this is something perhaps that reflects a difference between maybe the traditional civil war literature, or at least the literature that is in the post-Cold War period, which tends to, for example, focus on non-state actors. There's an implicit bias, perhaps, that their non-state actors are the problem, and in some ways the state is not the solution, but in many ways the less destructive aspect of the civil war conflict, or at least that the violence by the state is somehow made more legitimate than the violence that is pursued by non-state actors. And I think there's also a sense of in this paper of trying to highlight and centralize the importance of states in driving the conflict in Syria, in driving the destruction, but also the creation of conflict economies. And this is not just the Syrian state, which, of course, its actions, we discuss it in the paper, but also regional states and international states. So although there's a lot of focus in Syria on armed groups and militias, there's also a need to look at the different actions pursued by states in creating the destruction that we find in the country today, but not just internally, also externally, the regional landscape. And when we talk about these actions, we look at, of course, bombing, we look at financing armed groups, we look at basically the facilitation of transfer of, let's say, fighters into the country, but also in a broader sense, economic policies pursued by the United States and the European Union and pressured by multinational institutions before the conflict to pursue or to create a fragile, unequal economic landscape due to neoliberal economic policies. We examine the regional Cold War, so to speak, the way that regional actors instrumentalize identity to pursue their foreign policy. We look at the ways that the United States increased its pressure on Iran in the years leading up to the conflict, as well as the fallout and the impact from the destruction of the invasion of Iraq. So all of these factors, I think, are absent from some of the traditional civil conflict literature that we try to highlight in the paper. I don't know if we've lost Bassam, but suddenly his account seems frozen. Maybe he didn't like what I was saying.
I actually didn't like it at all. No, I'm joking. I'm on. I just want to be.
Can I just add?
I actually was going to ask, if you don't mind, Rabie, to add to what Omar said, but also to tell us as you wrap up, because we are getting close to our wrap up time, if you can tell us a little bit about how and why this sort of work and this sort of research, it's different from what quite a bit of the research out there is about, and how it tackles things differently for different purposes that are not always the most conventional purposes, and how it has a long-term vision behind it. So if you could just tell us about this paper, and also about the Development Policy Forum angle in general, I would really appreciate it. As you know, we collaborate on a lot of these projects, and I think this is something that is worthwhile.
Yeah, I think just a few points. The first one is what's new about this framework is that we are not, as Omar mentioned, we are not concentrating on the phenomena. We are not concentrating on some events or some behavior of conflict elite. We are concentrating on the policies, which is sometimes absent from the analysis of many researchers or centers. So, and it's the regional and international policies, because, for example, the investment of Russia and Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Egypt, Saudi Arabia in the Syrian conflict is not measured yet. So we need to understand and diagnose this black hole of consuming all of these resources to produce or to sustain the conflict. The second issue, the critical review for our understanding for humanitarian assistance, for civil society rule, for private sector, all of these actors, which we look for them as a neutral or peace-building actors, actually they are participating indirectly in many aspects of the conflict economy. And this is how we critically trying to understand how these different actors are building this kind of giant conflict economy that can continue and expand and building its transnational networks across the region and beyond. The second point is to understand why we have deterioration in the economy while we have less battles. So, and I think conflict economy and the dialogue that we are, trying to conduct or to facilitate is very important to understand that you are losing the trust, the relations, you are destroying the human capital, and you build new kind of institutions, which is conflict-centered institutions. So it's not that you are reducing the battles so you will have more recovery. It is that you need to have a shift in the institutions and rebuild of the relations to start again a new kind of economy and reduce the burden and bringing the productivity and bringing the equity sustainability again. So I think this is a kind of gate to start to understand, rather than trying to follow the deterioration or devaluation of the currency and the increase of the prices. We have to look to the machine that produce the deterioration, and one main machine is the conflict economy. And I think Omar can explain more on the options that could be not far away from bringing this to be a solution or to be an alternative for the future of Syria.
Omar, would you like to address this or?
Yeah, sure.
And
So
in a way, if you want to sort of also combine your message with wrapping up of the discussion, and we are going to, of course, tell our viewers in the post that they will be viewing that this paper is available to download, and it actually has a summary that you can see on the website, but you can download the full paper with the 5 chapters: introduction, leap up to the conflict, literature review toward a comprehensive framework, and then the existing conflict economies, which is a relatively short paper that is quite readable and perhaps one of the most lucid pieces I've looked at out there. So please try to contextualize the last part of this discussion for us, Omar, and maybe let us know, both of you, because I'll try to leave it to you to do say the final word. What can we expect going forward from the production of the forum?
yeah, so I'll just add, picking up on where Rabie mentioned, part of the goal of this is to lead to an understanding of the conflict in order to think about, how do we exit the conflict economies? And this is the common denominator of all the series of papers that the SCPR is going to be producing. And so one of the advantages, I think, of the approach that we have, there are multiple advantages. I mean, I think one of it is in my view, is that there's a proliferation of what I think is distorted knowledge production about Syria. And I think that distorted knowledge production is not an accident, because all the different actors in the conflict are investing not just in the pursuit of armed conflict, they're also investing in the pursuit of, or they're also investing in the production of knowledge production about the conflict. And I think different sides are very happy to explain to you a partial story of what's happening in the country, which usually documents the crimes of the other parties, their enemies in what's happening. And I think what we really need is to understand the different sides, the holistic picture here. So that's one aspect of this. The second aspect of this is that, looking at this totality, it might seem that it's increasing, making the conflict even more intractable. But I think the framework and our thinking about this is designed actually to make us focus on the fact that these phenomena that Rabie is referring to can be traced back to policies. They're not just happening on their own. They're phenomena that have been the outcome of, whether they're official or unofficial policies or actions taken by different actors. And that in order to start thinking about exiting the conflict economies, in some ways, it requires significant transformational change at the institutional level. But at the same time, there are multiple actions that the different actors can take that can immediately improve the lives of a vast majority of Syrians. And this improvement in their lives can take place, whether it's the improvement at the level of ending the suffering, at the level of deprivation, but also improving the options that they have available to them from a broader, more holistic human development perspective, as in increasing their capacity to pursue the means that they choose to pursue, to reviving civil society in the country in a broad sense of civil society. So there's a range of policies that we focus on in terms of thinking about exiting the conflict economies. And these range from local level policies, which includes combating looting and pillaging, rehabilitation of infrastructure, encouraging cooperatives and workers and farmers organizations, to national level policies, to international level policies. And this is really an invitation for people to read the paper, to interact with us, to give us feedback, to participate in this discussion that I think is necessary if we are to really find a solution for the suffering that's taking place in Syria.
Thanks, Omar. Any last words, Rabia or Omar?
Uh,
يعني
just
مش last words.
as Brie last word, just to say that one interesting issue in these discussions, and which is actually including more than 60 participants across different workshops, is the reinvesting in society. So rethinking about society as an actor. Even in the dismantling or creating conflict economy, how this society and different initiatives and different forms of informal institutions could be an important part in the future of the economy reconstruction, dismantling conflict economy. I think this is a very interesting idea. And the other one is the partial solutions or gradual solutions. For example, what is the interest of the subjugating powers like the regime to reduce the investment in the conflict economy when they have a lot of lack of stability and uncertainty? So do they have any interest of shifting these policies? So thinking in this way is very challenging, but at the same time, it's something that those people from different backgrounds want to find a solution. Not the complete solution, but a gradual one based on evidence. And I think this is a step, a very humble step, but I think it could be accumulated in the future.
شكرا Omar. Well, I should say shukran Rabie for the last comment. Shukran Omar. This was eye-opening, and I'm hoping and assuming many would be looking forward to reading the report and the research, the paper that Omar authored, as well as what's to come from the forum. Thank you all both so much for joining me and us, and I hope we can continue the conversation in the future.
Thank you, Bassam. Thank you, Omar.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.
سلام. دغري عمر الفل يعني معقول؟ عمر ما عندك لحظة شوية هيك
خاف تكمل تسجيل.
كلام هيك شوية. طيب ربيع شكرا كثير، لأنه أنا حخلي هيدا المقطع بس أفتح.
لا تخليه، لا
الله يخليك. يلا
لا بليز. طيب حبيبي نحكي يلا.
لك في بوستت نوت صفرة وراك على الشمال.
هي شو اسمه الكود تبع الانترنت اللي بدك واي فاي.
عم بقدر اقرا، قربت عملت زومينج ما قدرت. طيب يلا تيك كير. باي.